Thank you so much for doing this. This is so great. For the listeners, we have Joshua Dairen. You said Dairen, right?
Dairen, yep.
Great, perfect. Want to make sure. I'm even like some of the things we're going to talk about today. I'm already know that I'm going to mess up the pronunciation of these Irish names because I texted my dad being like, one of the things, and I should probably introduce you, but I already know I'm going to mess up some of the pronunciations. So I feel like Irish people are going to be like, actually.
Yeah, I'm not even going to try. Pronunciations are not my strong suit. Like, I can't tell you how many times on TikTok that people have been like, yeah, you said that wrong, doofus. And I'm like, I know that now. So thank you.
Also, so rude, doofus. It's like, firstly, words are hard. Secondly, like, you could just, I bet you those people aren't making a couple of videos a day, so they can feck off, as far as I'm concerned. And for the listeners, we already did a podcast together where we were on the Real Hauntings, and you do a lot of on TikTok. You do like urban legends, creatures, mythology, myths. I can't. Oh, anyway, and you do a bit of true crime as well, right?
Yep, I try to cover a wide-ranging just set of topics. It's mostly paranormal, but I do like to, as we kind of mentioned on that podcast as well, trick people into learning. So as much education as I can throw in there, I like to do it. So sometimes people like that. Sometimes people are like, "Yeah, please stop. I just want to hear about the hauntings."
No, I think that's great. I just realized maybe I should do this in a different view as I'm recording it. I haven't done a Zoom podcast in so long. Okay, there. I think that's probably better. Or no, I don't know. Anyway, that was just I'm gonna have to cut that little part out.
Enjoy.
That's so great. I do think when we did that podcast together, it got me inspired to look back over Irish folklore because I loved learning about it when I grew up. When I was growing up, it's something my dad would always talk about, and I feel like Irish folklore mythology, not a lot of people know about it. But then I watch like Game of Thrones or The Wheel of Time, and I'm like, sorry, this story is right out of Irish folklore.
Yeah, like I won't say I know a lot about Irish folklore, but as I was just kind of looking through, yeah, it's kind of tragic. Kind of tragic.
Definitely.
A lot of love stories. A lot of hard words to pronounce, as we mentioned before. But yeah, so I'm intrigued to see what you came across as well.
Yeah, I was thinking because obviously, like, so for the listeners, I know this is like the Shift podcast, which is usually dating, relationships, sex sometimes, but also sometimes it's just a chats. But I thought it would be fun because especially since we're in the middle of Valentine's and then St. Patrick's Day coming up, to do like a fun, like the folklore around like relationships. So there's all these like love stories in Irish folklore that, like you said, just end in tragedy. Oh my God. And yeah, and it is funny. On a side note, I saw this American, I don't know what he is, he's like a writer or something, say like that Ireland was he says is the first to do like a lot of romantic love, but I don't think that's true. But he said like wrote a lot of romantic stories, and it is all the way back to like the folklore, which I think is so funny because we're like really like not able to talk about our feelings. It's like, oh, he writes this big love story after she dies. Probably never told her he loved her once, but then he's like, my broken heart in loads of pieces. It's just so funny.
That sounds about right for an artist of any kind. Like I would say, like my wife gets on to me all the time because I also do music, and she's like, "Wow, that's really deep." Where'd that come from? And I was like, it's in me. I got to pull from somewhere. And she's like, "Well, how come that doesn't happen, like all the time?" And I'm just like, "Well, artists, and you got to bottle it up to let it out." And so yeah, I can relate.
Yeah, your Valentine's Day card to her was just like, love you loads. And then she sees you at a gig and you're like, the love of my life is beautiful like roses or whatever.
That's exactly how it happens every time. I've been working on it, but yeah, that's her biggest gripe. So I think it's funny. I don't want to be that person, but I was doing my ancestry, and it does appear that I do have a little bit of Irish in me. So it could be that little teensy 2.3%, coming out like the Irish. I really don't think so, but
Yeah, you never know. I hope it was the good Irish and not some of the bad guys. So,
Yeah, yeah, I don't know if it was good Irish, but that's either
Yeah,
here
yeah.
nor there.
I don't know. You hear some good stories like about the Irish and let's say there was like a lot of Irish people who were indentured servants sent over to the islands, and then that there's like some good stories that came out of that with good relationships. For obviously there was like black slaves sent over there as well. But then you hear like some of them who got out of indentured servitude and then became slave owners themselves. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's a yeah,
it's hairy.
bastards. Yeah. There
It's
was
hairy.
actually a story. I was looking into it a lot recently. I just stumbled on a TikTok from a guy talking about it, kind of like the two different relationships. But then I got looking up because obviously there's that like white Americans try to push that myth, which is a myth about Irish slaves, which isn't true. There was indentured servants, but it was only 7 years, and it wasn't even you
Yep.
can't even, it's not comparable. So it's very frustrating because they shouldn't do that. But I was researching and reading up about it, and there was one woman, and this is a tragic love story. So who she fell in love with a black man, and her the guy she was working for, this black man was his slave, and they got married in secret. And the guy she was working for
Oh,
her said, "You're now going to be a slave." So it's probably the one actually true Irish person who was a slave. And she was like, "Yeah, that's fine." She said something like, he was like, "What do you think about that?" And she said, well, I'd rather be with him than ever look at you again, something like that. And
I
they
like that.
yeah, they
Well,
found
I
like,
hate that, but I like that.
I
Yeah.
know it's like a tragic love story. Again,
Yeah.
fits in really with Irish. Her name was Eleanor something, like Eleanor Bush or something like that. I can't remember, but or maybe anyway, they said in the article, because in this article they were saying like people need to stop with the myth as well, but they were saying this is the one case, and they had all these different stories as well, and they had like bad stories too about like about Irish people, but anyway. But this story, they said they could find 100 years later her descendants and this man's descendants still suing to try to get out of slavery. So 100 years later, their descendants were
Wow.
still in slavery. Yeah, mad, isn't it?
Yeah, that's wow. That's phew.
Yeah,
Wow.
tragic love story, but yeah, she sounds like a badass.
Yeah, I love that kind of I love that kind of commitment to your partner though, where it's just like I'm I would rather be with the person that I love than like conform to what you're talking about. And I think you know, that's something to be admired. I mean, even if it's in the worst tragic, circumstances, that's love. I think that's love because that's you're choosing to be in that situation because you're also choosing to love this person too. And it's kind of twofold in that regard.
Yeah, I agree with you because I feel like that also links back to the folklore, because all of the folklore stories, they had to make these kind of like hard decisions, and they usually choose love over what would benefit them better, and they always end up kind of being fucked for it. But it kind of seems like the moral of all the folklore stories is better to have loved and lost than to, which I don't feel like anybody in our day and age would probably do that. But and it was interesting with the folklores, they were saying that there was like four different types that they come from. And then this one, the Fenian folklores, are all very like love and like love stories and tragedy. And yeah, so yeah, maybe that woman was brought up on a lot of folklore. She was like
Yeah. And it's kind of funny that you say that too, because when I think about American fairy tales and love, it's the exact opposite almost. It's not like, yeah, I'm choosing to love this person and then, it turns out tragic, which I feel is a more realistic representation of kind of how love can be sometimes. It's more like, yeah, I chose this person and everybody has to deal with it, and we're gonna go live happily ever after. And now we're royalty basically, in so many words. Like, I mean, the classic like Prince Charming kind of trope, the classic like damsel in distress, and now the mighty man gets to save the woman from despair. Like, I think that's more of the fairy tale that people have latched their hooks into in terms of how they want to pattern their love, as opposed to the actual like, no, like, you're gonna love somebody, it might be a little tragic, it's gonna be a little hard, there's like a lot, there's more nuance, and I think I'm drawn to more of that realism. So I appreciate that. Um, like they push towards that in Ireland. I would say.
yeah, they actually said, I was watching, all these different YouTubes about it. And they were saying that one of the reasons why they feel like Irish mythology isn't as popular as all the rest, or isn't as spread as far, is because like, and like all the movies you look like a Thor or whatever, all those are based off I guess Greek and Roman and Viking and all that crap. Not crap, sorry, I shouldn't say that because it's all interesting, but like compared to mine. But they were saying they think because those have very clear like the gods have reasonings for what they do, and it's all about the gods, whereas in Irish mythology it's about the people, and then the gods don't really have any they're like mentioned, but there's not a reason for what happens. It's more like what the people, and the people have magic and what they do, and the fairy people, which is the word that I was afraid of, because I always was brought up called that it was the wait, oh, now I'm fucking up, two-headed Donna. But then I saw an American and he was like saying something totally different. I was like, that can't be right. And then I saw this old Irish guy and he was saying something different. So then I text my dad and he was like, that's the way I say it, is the way you say it. So there are different like ways of saying Irish too in Ireland, depending on where you're from. So that could be it as well. But yeah, they were like this like people who came to Ireland, and then they eventually lost in like long, they were fighting for a really long time. But when they lost, they were put into the like a different realm. So they became like the fairy people. And so
Yeah.
that's
And
where, oh, sorry, go ahead.
forgive me if I'm wrong. Do they also call them the Fae folk? Because I've also heard that before.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I was reading one
Okay.
story and they were calling them the little people in the story, but that was like about like little fairies, whereas the fairies that I've read about before weren't like little people, like little, they were like all different. There was all different. So some of them were just like shapeshifters or just like regular, or some were like paler than Irish people, which like I don't know how you get paler than Irish people.
No comment. That's a
So
trap.
oh no, not at all. I just think we're known to be pretty pale. So do you ever see that meme where it's like Irish person sunbathing and there's a really pale person, you're like, oh, yeah, they're pretty pale, and then you see behind it's actually you can't see them because they blend in with the sand. Have you ever seen that?
I have.
So good. But yeah, so I feel like those tragic love stories come out of that, because it's usually someone involved with a Dini Sheed, which is like the fairy people. Oh, they're just so they're so sad. Should we read? Will I read out a couple?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do know of one, and it's the whole changeling theory.
Oh yeah.
Too. That's one that I've come across actually in kind of American lore as well. We don't
Oh, there
really
was like
call
a
them.
movie.
Yeah. It's going. I was on the tip of my tongue and it just left. But
Sorry.
um, I forgot what the movie is. But yes, exactly. Like there are like this similar like ideals, I would say, in terms of like they're kind of interdimensional, as opposed to like the as we talked about in the Real Hauntings pod, kind of like the Lucky Charms kind of style of people. And I just find it so interesting, like the whole changeling theory. Actually, I'm pretty sure I listened to the same person when you sent me that DM. I was actually watching him at the same time, so I just happened to come across him. And first of all, I could listen to that man talk all day, because what a great storyteller.
Right. Oh my
I
God.
loved his storytelling. But he told the story about the changeling. I was so fascinated by that. And just kind of how he was going down the line of like the shapeshifters, and sometimes they turn into like dark colored animals or bugs. And I didn't know that. And so I was getting sucked in. So I'm about to watch, and I started watching a little bit on the Banshee too. That's neither here nor there. I'm getting sidetracked. But yeah, the fairy like legends are fascinating to me.
Oh, me too. And I always grew up knowing what he had said. I forget his name. I think it was Eamon something. I should look it up before we end and say his name properly. But yeah, he was such a fantastic storyteller and he really gets into it.
Yeah.
And he's no problem, like, because my boyfriend kind of like came in as he was talking and he was like saying how long winded he is. But I actually kind of like that, because I feel like our
Yeah.
attention span nowadays is very like get to the point. But with him, you're like, I felt like I could picture it as he was talking about it.
No, he drew the full picture. Like I was in the woods, I was in the house, I was looking at the baby in the crib, I was watching him play the music to the baby, I was watching the baby like talk back to him, and the hot iron. I saw everything, and I love that storytelling from him. As you can tell, I really like him. But he was a good storyteller.
He got 2 new fans today.
Yep.
Yeah. But it's true. The changeling thing is funny because that was, let's say, like for any of the listeners who don't know about changelings, it's usually that the fairies would put in a replica of your baby and then they would take your baby. And so like Irish people would usually think like if their baby had like I'd say it probably just was like colic or something, or maybe sick, but they would think it was a changeling. And I believe Scottish people might have done it too, but then they would try to give the changeling baby back in hope that their baby would return. But and I remember reading something about sometimes people would put the baby down a well, but like I honestly think it might have been just like really sick babies. But then
Yeah.
you don't know, because with the fairy stories, there are stories of like people chopping down a fairy tree and like actually getting really sick afterwards, or other things happening that you're kind of like, oh, maybe it's a coincidence. But it seemed to be in Ireland anyway. Like they built a whole motorway around, so there's just like this circle around this fairy tree because they were terrified to cut it down, and that's still like modern times.
Yeah, and I think it's funny, like even if you it's funny how like superstitions and myths just carry over time. And even if there's like not any real weight to it when it started, I think it's fascinating how people put that weight into it later and then things actually start happening. So even if you're on the fence of like, I don't know if I really believe that, I'm, you know, interdimensional beings that have, can shapeshift, I don't know. But then you start listening to some of the theories or just how much reverence are put towards some of these myths. It's just, that's cool. And honestly, I would love to see that fairy tree at some point,
Yeah.
just to get eyes on it.
Oh my God, I'll send you a picture of it because it is really cool. I'll try to like put a picture up here for the I don't know how to do that for the viewers. But yeah, I think yeah, it's really interesting. It must have been a better way to cope as well. Like if there was something wrong with your baby and they didn't have the science and you're just like, oh well, I guess a fairy took it and he just put it in the woods. I mean, that's bad for that baby, but maybe. Oh yeah, I don't know, but yeah, it's very, very interesting. The banshee thing is very interesting as well, just like a screaming woman, and people would say they would hear it and not see it. But I think that's just cats in heat, because when you hear them scream, it sounds like a banshee. So I
Yeah,
just wonder if there might. But then that woman, a Sophia West Cork. So if you were interested in true crime, have you watched that one on Netflix?
I haven't.
That would be a great one for you to cover, because it's a French woman bought a house in Cork, and at the time there'd never been like a murder in Cork other than just like a fist fight in a bar. Do you know what I mean? Not like a premeditated murder. And this woman was like assaulted and murdered. I think she was like I think like sexually assaulted. And
Oh
but in
no.
it, yeah, and it was by a British guy who they still haven't been able to. He's been convicted in France, but there wasn't enough evidence because it was the first time police in Ireland had to even try to figure out like CSI. They didn't have any of the stuff at the time, so he's still walking around West Cork. He has like a market, but it's like 100% him. And if he ever leaves the country, like the French would be able to get him. But yeah, so he's just hiding. It's like a whole big thing because in Ireland you can't kick them out. I don't know. It's something to do with our laws, so he's able to stay. But in the
Wow.
whole thing, they're like interviewing all these people, and one friend says, yeah, she said she saw like a banshee, the day that she died, but then they never come back to it. And I'm like, let's circle back to this banshee,
Yeah.
you know?
Like, let's talk more about that. I want to
Yeah,
know about that.
she said to her friend she saw a woman like a banshee figure screaming in a castle as she was going on her walk. And then they just fucking glossed over it. I was like, we need to be talking about this, okay? The banshee gave her a heads up.
Yeah, and and, like the banshee myth is the one that scares me the most personally, just because like even in my own research with stories that have nothing to do with like Ireland or anything, it's banshees. Like I could think of a story in Georgia where there was a banshee that allegedly like traveled with the family, and like anytime somebody was getting ready to die, the banshee would show up, do her thing, and that person would literally pass, and it was just a continual thing over like decades. And then once the family eventually like kind of died out, I mean, the banshee went away and nobody ever reported that same activity. So it's those things that give me goosebumps, because they're so hard to explain away.
I think she's kind of cool though. She's like, I like this family. I'm gonna give them a heads up a couple of hours so they can say their goodbyes. So every
I mean,
time
that's fair.
yeah, she's probably
That's
like, I like them. I'll stick with them and give them a heads up every time, and they're just like terrified.
Can't sleep that night.
Yeah. They're like, is she coming? um, let me see. Okay. Oh, I should probably just like read like a probably shouldn't read it out because it's kind of long, but there was one of which I thought was fun, and his name is Fionn there. I just said I thought was Fionn. I thought was fun was Fionn and Sad. And theirs is that he was like a Fun McCool was like a Fenian guy. He was like a Fenian leader of the army, and he was out shooting or hunting, and he saw a deer, and his dogs, his hounds, one of them or both of them had been given birth by a hound who had been a woman before, who had been turned into a hound. So they were kind of mystical anyway. And when they saw this deer, they were like, I don't know what they did. I don't know if they barked or something, but they were like, there's something weird about this deer. So he brought the deer back to his house because he was like, it seems like a magical deer. It doesn't seem like I should kill it. And when he brought it onto his land, it turned into a woman. So it had been a woman who was cursed by like some druid or something, some guy, to turn into a deer. Yeah, so when she was on that land, she would turn into a deer. But anyway, so Sive and I think I'm pronouncing her name right, but in Fionn, they fell in love and she got pregnant. They got married and everything. But then one day he was off doing some fighting stuff, and the druid came and he took her back and he put her back on that land, so she turned back into a deer. And Fionn looked for her forever and he couldn't find her, but then he found a little baby doe. Or I think that's what they're called, like a little baby deer. And he was like, I think this is my child. So when he brought it back, that child, like that doe morphed into a child, or that deer, sorry, morphed into a child. So that was his baby boy, and that became Oisin. And then Oisin ends up having a really sad love story too. So Oisin grows up and he there's a woman who's from Tiernanog, which is the land of the youth, but she's a fairy woman. And she comes up one day. I can't remember why she's up in Ireland. And he falls in love with her, and they get married, and he moves to Tiernanog with her. And so when they're there for 3 years, he says, like, I really want to go back and visit my father and see how my family are. Like, I really miss them. And she's like, okay, fine, you can go back, but you have to stay on this mystical horse, and you can never once put your foot on the land in Ireland. And because he's a human. And she's obviously mystical, so she can go back and forth. But I guess she didn't explain why, or maybe she didn't say how serious it was. But when he went back to Ireland, those 3 years in Tiernanog were 300 years in Ireland. So his father's long gone, and he's so depressed and struck with grief, and he's going around the whole country and like everything's changed, everything's different. But he ends up falling off his horse, and then he morphed into an old person and he died because obviously he's not meant to be only 3 years older. He's meant to be like 300 years older.
Oh, shoot.
And that was the end of their love story.
Wow. That's a hard brick wall ending.
So sad.
Wow.
I mean, I guess that's different than there was another story that was very similar to like choosing your love over there's like loads of those stories, but I thought that story was sad because it was like both the father and son found love that was like taken away from them, in like because his wife will never get to see him again because he didn't fucking listen. Typical man.
Yep.
But maybe she didn't explain it right. I'm sure men listening and be like, well, maybe she said it like 300 words and I zoned out.
I mean, to be fair, a man did write it, so he probably like glossed over that anyways. Because I know how men are. So he was just like, yeah, she barely explained it, and he didn't really know. So man's not at fault right here.
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's a very tragic folklore, mythical love. The other one that was more like what we were talking about earlier what was that one? Oh, there was like a guy who went to get an Irish princess for a king in England. And when he got her, he was just like a knight or something like that, but he fell in love with her. And she fell in love with him. But I think they fell in love because they by accidentally drank some potion, but I like love potion. But I don't know how that happened.
That'll
they kind
do
of glossed over that as well. And so she ends up like running away with him on her wedding night, like before she gets married, I think. And they had to run away, even though they knew both of them would have like a short time before they'd get found. And I think something happened like where one of them got killed. Or maybe I'm mixing up two stories here because now I'm thinking, but anyway, there's some story where they ran off together. The guy who she was meant to marry finds her. Now I'm thinking that that's a different, because there's one where there's a knight and she ends up getting caught and getting brought back to the English king. And then there's another one where there's an Irish king, and she runs off with a warrior. And when he eventually finds them, like years later, they've been on the run, they've been having a great time, they love each other, it's all for love. He kills the guy, or he says that it's over, it's done, that they don't need to worry about it anymore. He pardons them, but actually, then he brings her lover to like a hunting thing, and one of the animals kills him. And he could, oh, you know who this is? As I'm saying it, that's Fionn. Fionn's a little prick, actually. So, because then Fionn McCool, when his wife died, I'm pretty sure it's him. Years later, they were like, "You should remarry," and it was this girl, and she fell in love with a warrior from the Fenian army when she met him. But she was like way younger than him as well. He was like an old man at this stage, so that's why. And Fionn McCool, he could, and I hope everybody's gonna comment now if I mess this up, but let me know. He could like give water to people, and it would save them, it would heal them. So when he had pardoned them and they came back, and he's like out hunting with this guy, the guy gets stabbed by like a boar or something, and he's about to die, and he goes to give him the water, but he lets it drip through his fingers twice, so he doesn't let let him have the healing water. And
That's
then
cold-blooded.
Right. And then and he's already grandfather. You already had your love, okay? He's probably like, my love was taken away from me. I'm not letting anybody else have love. But then she jumps off like a building or something because she's so heartbroken. She can't live without him.
Wow, that is cold. That's cold-blooded. I was feeling bad for him at first, but now, I don't know. That's petty. He must be a Gemini.
Yeah. People let us know in the comments if I'm right, but I'm pretty sure that was him when he was an old guy. And there is definitely another similar story about then there was another similar story that's not like folklore, but just an old story of a haunted castle in Kinsale. And the daughter, so there's a king and the daughter, oh my god, this is so fucked up. So the daughter falls in love with a guy, and the king, like a soldier, and the king lets her get married, even though she should marry someone like out of royalty. But then something happens where he's like he's watching, or what's he doing? He's like watching the thing, but the dad thinks he's like a traitor, because I can't remember the exact story, but some reason why he gets him mixed up and thinks he's a traitor, so he stabs him, and then he feels so bad when he realizes it's his daughter's betrothed, and then he stabs himself, and then the daughter has lost her dad and her future husband, so she throws herself off the castle into the rocks. And now the legend is that it's haunted by her, this castle in Kinsale in Cork.
Wow, I'm starting to think Shakespeare might have ripped off of some of his stories too, because that sounds like a perfect Shakespeare like play.
Yeah, no, 100%. Of course, the English would steal from Ireland.
It's funny. Like, this is a weird aside, but I watched Outlander with my wife, and the English 100% just steal everything. No offense to any English listeners. I mean, it's just facts.
Yeah. I mean, they stole off you guys too. The English, I mean, I think people like to. It's easier to group people sometimes. But like the English were terrible to their own as well. Like they're very poor people. The poor people, they were like, yeah,
we're horrible to the Scots, horrible. to like Ireland, horrible to anything like East and South and West and North. So they were just terrors across. But that's either here or there. But it does sound like something like would come from like a Shakespeare play. It's so tragic. Do you have any inkling why things ended so tragically? And like their stories, or it's just like a cultural thing?
I have no idea. I feel like it might be a cultural thing, but I don't know. Yeah, maybe we just like tragedy. I don't know. Very dark people.
Yeah, like I knew it was dark, but I didn't know it was this dark. This is dark. And it sounds exactly like you said, Game of Thrones plot, throw it in season 5, episode 6, and it could just fit right in, and you would never even know it was an English, like an Irish folktale.
No, absolutely. And there's so much stuff that's not even just like the folklore, but like how old Ireland would have been, like with the Brehon laws and the kings and stuff. And I feel like that at some point, now I know the guy who wrote The Wheel of Time did say that he took from Irish folklore. He also took from like different folklores as well. I don't remember which ones, but he did mention it. So I should look up your man from Game of Thrones. Maybe he does say, but yeah, I'd say because even like the laws and the way, like some of it just seems a bit like. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe yeah, just so like just everybody dying in Game of Thrones as well. That's such a Irish folklore. Like everybody always dies at the end of the story.
Yeah. On that, like, I'm kind of, I'm thinking through, are these folklore still like kind of things that like you guys still talk about, or um is it kind of like going to YouTube and finding our guy telling stories to like keep those stories alive?
So I would say now it's probably going to YouTube. Like when I was small, my dad bought me all the books and he told me all the stories. But he is very like, he also told me all about like Irish history and stuff like that. So that could have been like a personal thing with him. And he's from the countryside. But I'd say nowadays, yeah, I'd say people aren't telling the stories as much. And like even with that storyteller we watched, like that was his job. Whereas like once TVs came in and there's all these different, and even in one of them, he was like, if you couldn't sing, tell a story, dance, or do something entertaining, you were like useless. You're a waste of air, he said at one point. Whereas that's not the case anymore. Like people watch TV and they're constantly entertained with their phones and stuff. But since um Colleen Kuhn, that movie that just got nominated for an Oscar, Banshees of Inisherin, I do think that Irish people are starting to get back more to their roots and like wanting to learn Gaeilge, which is Irish language. And I do think all that folklore is going to come back. I think there is a big, I don't know if there's a better word than renaissance. Is that the right word? But like renewal or something to getting back to
Yeah,
like that Gaelic kind of culture, because it's really interesting. Like loads of
it
stuff
is.
like even when you read the stories about like mythical creatures and they would come out on Halloween, which when you look at like Latin culture, there's a link there. And it probably all comes back to like like a bit of paganism or whatever. Like we have the new Grange and stuff like that. And then we have other megaliths that would be like, oh, there was like some lover story, but there's like a big megalith that's like a stone thing that they say it was their bed. So it's called like Diarmid and Grania's Laba. So yeah, there's just like, yeah, something there. I feel like people are getting more into that kind of like, I mean, like people are getting really into astrology. So that's back to like the stars, the suns, and
Yeah. Yeah, and I would love to see like that renaissance happen in the United States too, because I think we have so many unique and diverse people here. And we understand so little about other cultures besides just traditional American culture. And so if that renaissance can happen here, I think it's all for the better, because I mean, when you really think about it, so many of our myths and legends are just derivatives of other myths and legends like that come from places like Ireland and overseas. Um, and I think it give a lot of perspective in when it comes to how different people interact with other people, which directly affects love and relationships and dating and all those things too.
yeah, I think it is nice to. I would rather choose my love over anything. Like, do you know what I mean? If I had someone that I was in love with that much that I think people now are maybe more materialistic or like, you know, I want all this money, I want all that. It is a strange world that we live in. I like those stories of hearing people who were like, no, I'd rather um be in love than
Yeah.
anything else. And even like the another thing that Irish guy said was like how the with the storytelling and stuff and how the poor would always have you in your house and they'd share anything with you. And just a line that he said, and he said, sure, the rich would give you nothing. And it is so true. um
Yeah.
and I don't know. And then back to that story of that Eleanor girl that she would rather, and she had, I'm sure she had a choice not to. I mean, the poor guy had no choice in that. But yeah, she'd rather be with her partner and in love than her freedom.
Yeah, and it's something to say, because I do think that a strong partner can carry you through pretty much anything. Um, because it's the age old adage like, when I'm weak, you're strong. When you're and
Yeah.
and I think that's really reflected in that story in particular too. Because I mean, she had a choice and she
Yeah.
chose something completely. So she went against the grain. She went counterculture, and it was just a cultural thing. I, based on how I view the world, am choosing you over what I could have. Like, because what I could have doesn't equate to what I do have, and so it really is a beautiful story, like kind of buried down in tragedy and sadness. And I think that might be the beauty of like Irish folklore as well. There's some beauty in it, buried deep down, amongst a lot of sadness and tragedy.
Yeah. And look, at that time as well, like I don't think any women would have, or they would have lied, or they wouldn't have done that. So it's like, yeah, very, very unique. Yeah. And the fact that they even went on to have kids and everything. So I must research more about her and her husband, and see where did the kids even end up. I wonder if they're like in America right now. Like
Yeah,
not
like
their
I'm
kids,
very
but like
intrigued.
distant kids. Great grandkids.
Yeah, that's the first time I've heard this story too. So I love history, so I'm going to be knee deep in researching that story. Probably like
I'll send you the article. They were if I find it, and it's like I have 100 tabs, so it has to be in here. Um there was a what was the and I think too, I think you're right, if people go back to more like folklore and stuff, especially in America, because it's so diverse, and it's
is
great. I want to start a podcast called Funny Folklore. I'll see if I have the time to do it, because I did do a show about it in the pandemic, but it basically where if I could interview people about their folklore, and see even the comparisons, because I think a lot of the stories sometimes, or you see the same mythical creatures in the stories. But yeah, there was a really fun one that I thought you'd like, is called a Puca. And he's a little creature who, if you are nice to him, he'll like bring you good luck and do loads of stuff. And there was this story about a kid who was really nice to him, and he was in the form of a bull, but he gave him something to keep him warm. So then he started doing all the work for his father every night, and his father's workers were really shit and lazy. So then his father was able to fire his workers, made all this money, but then the little boy felt bad for him, so he started to he got him like a little, because he was in like little rags when he was doing it, and when he became like a fairy person from not being a bull anymore. And so he got him a little suit, and then the little fairy guy was like, oh, I love being a gentleman now, I'm going to be a gentleman. So he stopped doing the work at night, but it didn't matter because the father had already become so rich he didn't really need any more, so they were fine. And because he was so rich, he was able to put his son into a good school, and his son got like went to a great college. And then one day he met this really lovely, beautiful woman, and he was like, "How am I so lucky to have a woman like this?" And then there was like a golden cup left at their wedding day. And he had like a wine, but nobody knew who it was from. And he was like, "I know it's from the Puca." So him and his wife drank it, and they had like the best luck for the rest of their life. So that was the Puca's way of saying thank you for being doubly kind.
as a Golden Girls would say, thank you for being a friend. That
Yeah.
is, I love that story. That's a really warm-hearted story for the most
Yeah.
part.
And we only have a minute left. I feel like I never upgraded this after the pandemic, but can you let people know where to find you?
Yeah, so you could find me anywhere at Joshua Dairen. That's Dairen. I'm very interactive. I like to talk to people on social, so you don't have to look far. You type in Joshua Dairen one place, it's there everywhere.
Thank you so much. You were the best. I hope you had fun.
Yeah, I did. Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun. I have a lot of thoughts still, but maybe we can do this again.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk more. Maybe I'll end up doing that funny folklore podcast.
I would love that. That'd be great.
Okay, great. Okay, talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.